All right, thanks again for joining us this afternoon. This is a presentation by AppGeo, Better Together Using Commercial GIS Data in Government Systems. And we'll be getting started here with today's presentation on licensed data products and what they can mean for your organization. So today we're going to be taking a look at the world of licensed data and what it means for your state or the organization that you work within. And licensed data products are truly everywhere across the software, entertainment industries, and now geospatial data is part of that ecosystem as well. We're hoping that after spending some time with us today, you'll have a better understanding of the options that exist in the marketplace and feel more confident in understanding the terms behind their use and how you can apply them to your projects. We've got some great guests with us today who I'll be introducing very shortly. And again, for those of you who don't know me, I am Aaron Doucett with AppGeo, and this is our agenda for today. So you got a little bit of a sense of it, but we're going to start out by just walking through the basics of licensed data, what is out there and what are the trends surrounding it, the key benefits and opportunities that this model presents for you as the end user or perhaps the data manager for your state or org. We're going to dive into some of the more fun stuff in the terms and conditions and really understand why they're there, how to work with them instead of against them, and how to negotiate on your behalf. And then lastly, the fun part, we will have a Q&A session with our panel here today where you can try to stump the chumps, as they would say on Car Talk. So just to give you a quick sense of who we are at AppGeo, of course, we're based in Boston, Massachusetts, but have staff all over the country now. And we're really interested in this topic of data licensing because of our relationship with these providers. You know, we're partners to Google here, Hexagon, Cardo, and others. And we work with these technologies every day. And as such, we face the questions that we're going to be discussing, you know, working with our customers as an advocate for their success. So we're living and breathing this stuff. We want to help you understand it and find success as well. And with that, I'd like to introduce our panel for today. So to join me in this conversation, I brought together two of my very esteemed colleagues, David Breeding, who is a geospatial data expert, and Bill Johnson, who is an expert in the governmental use and management of data. And I felt that by combining these two unique perspectives, we have a really interesting discussion today from two different approaches, but the same problem at hand. So Bill and David, why don't we start by just a few words about yourself, your backgrounds, and what has you interested in this topic for today? And we can start with David.
Yeah, no, happy to. Thanks, Aaron. I definitely come to this topic from a practitioner that's been trying to leverage these tools, as Aaron alluded to. I often at AppGeo, I'm the director of analytics, and I often get involved in projects or working with clients as we approach their various geospatial challenges. Do they have the data in-house? Do we need to go out to the market to kind of create the data mix to answer the questions that they have? And oftentimes, the universe is plenty with data, but when the rubber meets the road, that's where, that's kind of the conversation we're going to get into. So that's where I'm coming from, and I'm excited to have this conversation.
Great. Thanks, David. And so I'm Bill Johnson. I spent the first 31 years of my career in the public sector, in a progression of GIS jobs in the state of New York. And when I retired, I was actually the state geographic information officer there. So lots of examples over the course of those years where we were working with commercial data and often mixing it or blending it with government or public data to create pretty robust applications. So I have a kind of a working familiarity with these issues around licensed data from the driver's seat of building these things in the public sector. So that's the perspective I'll have today.
Absolutely. So we appreciate you guys bringing those backgrounds to the conversation today. And Bill, I want to start off with some questions for you. You've been around the block a few times now from your, your career, and you've seen the growth and evolution of this industry and field as a whole. So, why is it that you like to call the time we're in right now a data renaissance period? If you could walk us through, what is that renaissance all about?
Yeah, and thank you for that polite way of saying I'm old. So yeah, so when I started out so many years ago, a lot of the spatial data we were working with was actually produced in the government sector. Either directly through a contract or was state workforce people collecting and building up these data sets. And what I've seen over time is, along with the explosion of data volumes, has been a shift to more and more of it coming from the commercial world. A lot of innovation, things like the coming autonomous vehicles require huge amounts of data. And so we're seeing a lot of this data now shifting away from government sourcing to sourcing in the commercial sector. And then another couple of important trends is that data now is very often bundled with commercial solutions. A lot of the commercial data is not just sold as bare data. It's in the context of an application programming interface, or API, that bundles functionality with data for things like geocoding or routing through a network, or lots of other examples like that. And often software that you buy comes bundled with data to make it easy for you to get up and working right out of the gate without having to provide your own data. And now we're in a stage where a lot of GIS is done with these mapping platforms that are cloud-hosted capabilities that have data and functions that you can string together without being a programmer necessarily to create some really important capabilities. So all of these things are shifting the balance of where the data comes from more and more to the commercial side, and more of that is available under the terms of a license.
Great answer. And let's dive into that just a little deeper. What are the key differences between this licensing approach that you've mentioned and the traditional approach to data creation and ownership? By extension, the data management piece that comes along. There's a cost to maintaining data, right? So How does this all break down?
Yeah. So let's just look at it briefly from the perspective of a buyer. So you're wanting to acquire some data that you don't have. You really have two options. One is to put out a set of specifications, to have a contractor build data for you to your specifications that you are going to own and then control. And that's the kind of traditional model for the way data has been produced by contractors in the government sector for a long, long time. And that lawyers call that a work for hire. And in a work for hire situation, the company that produces the data for you at the end of the job does not retain or own any rights to the data. The data is delivered to the government client, and the government client often is then making that data openly available in the public domain. Now, licensed data is kind of the flip side of that coin, where the commercial entity owns the data. They may have collected it for one or two major clients and then want to be able to continue to sell it. And the ability to sell that to multiple clients means that the cost that you're going to bear as a buyer is lower, because you're not having to pay for the full cost of its creation. And the way they do that is these license models. So everyone that is buying it is buying rights to use it, but not ownership of it. So they have what's called non-exclusive, meaning you're not the only one using it, rights under these license terms. So that's at a very high level, the basic difference.
For sure. And we'll get into some of the more cost-specific elements later in the presentation, but just to keep on the licensing topic for a minute, I think, it's very interesting to me, this example here, in that 10 years ago, I loved collecting, when MP3 players were out, having a big collection of music on a hard drive from all my favorite artists, and TV shows on a hard drive, and, physical copies of those media. And then 10 years later, I have nothing, right? It's streaming. It's Spotify for music, these streaming services for your favorite shows. And yes, there's a cost associated with subscribing, but when you think about the leverage of, $10 a month to have every album put out in the past 100 years effectively versus buying all those individually, there's a savings there. And I think people are starting to really live and breathe this in their personal lives. Tell us a little bit about how that has transformed the mental side of this.
Right. So there's been a very gradual but steady societal shift away from kind of ownership models where, like your example, collecting copies of digital music that you paid for, as MP3 files. In my era, it was vinyl albums that you stored in milk crates in your dorm room and whatever. But it's the same thing. You wanted to own the asset. But in many aspects of our everyday life, we're seeing a shift away from that ownership model and to this license model where you have rights to use a larger, more complete collection. And so it's not just music and entertainment, although those are both great and obvious examples, but even things like, now more than half the cars sold in this country are under a lease agreement where you don't actually own the car. The leasing company owns the car, and they are granting you a right to use the car. It feels like your car, and you treat it like your car. But at the end of the day, you have to give it back to the leasing company or buy it out from them at the end of that lease term. Likewise, home ownership has been in decline, and what we're seeing is more and more of a rental society in terms of our living space. I just signed a lease for my daughter, who's a college student, to move off campus next year into a kind of student apartment. And so there's many, many examples of this shift in our everyday lives. So licensing is nothing to be scared about. We're all doing it all the time.
So yeah, let's look at some examples now within our industry. And I think that's where we can start to look at how these models are applying to geospatial and data intelligence, as well as all these other aspects that we're probably very familiar with.
Right. So you see a bunch of logos on the screen there. In 100% of the examples on the screen there, you don't own the tool. You've clicked somewhere an I agree button and accepted the licensing terms, the terms of service, as they're sometimes called, to use that product. And so in the software world, all the applications on your phone, every single one of those apps, you may have paid a fee and feel like you bought the app, but you didn't buy the app. You just paid a license fee and you clicked I agree to the terms, and you're off to the races. So that's the way so much of this stuff in the digital world works. It's all under a license agreement.
Absolutely. So, David, I'd like to hear from you a little bit about how this is, from the data side, how this has impacted what you're seeing in your work, and then I'd like to get into some of the trends industry-wide that you're observing.
Yeah, no, I'm happy. Like, I think the other interesting point on this slide is just that you see these brands, but beneath all of them, they have their own agreements as well. So it is this kind of stacking, and it is increasing the availability of data, but it's a really interesting kind of moment right now to kind of just conceive of all this information. And I just kind of echo a little bit about what I'm seeing. It's this bundling kind of that's going on, and the options for platforms, whether they're BI tools, Carto was an early one that I really got, it's this concept really kind of solidified for me on the power that having all of this together, the time from which I had a question to the time at which I could start to see an answer started to decrease rapidly, because I had all of that substrate. I had all of that data that the provider, that's bundled together, whether it's open source data or private data that's been licensed themselves. It's just really changing how you can tackle problems. But there are, you really need to kind of think about that, though. Like, where is your journey taking you? Does this platform have the data you need, or are you going to need to kind of maybe pair multiple systems, which can increase the complexity out there? So, but this bundling is happening, and the relationships are continuing to grow. And we already talked about it, but from an API perspective, 2005, Google Maps APIs came on the market. They have 17 different API endpoints with hundreds of functions that are available to you to just request to start answering very discrete questions that are in your data flows. So the power that's there, how quickly you can start to answer questions, just astonishing. And here as well, entering a little bit later in 2012, but their data is flowing into Esri. We see Esri on the screen, right? They are leveraging here data behind the scenes to drive a lot of their information. But
if we could draw like lines between all of these, there's much more interconnectedness than might meet the eye.
Yeah, totally.
But yeah, it really sounds like, pre mid 2000s, you would have to spend a lot more time assembling the data before you can answer your question, whereas now it's more time doing the analytics, less time hunting around for the information in many cases.
Or considering the options. And I think, next slide, considering those options that are out there, rather than searching for the data, what are these solutions, what do they have? And then considering the licensing associated with it to make sure you're entering into a project scenario or setting up your direction from a company that to have the right tool. So, really that's kind of the trend that we're seeing out there is maybe some more time kind of investing in exploring and understanding how this market's shifting to really guide you. But I think there's always going to be a moment where you have to have local data. You're going to be storing and creating your own content, but the opportunities to mix and match it is what's kind of exploding out there. That data provider data and your data that you're creating.
For sure. So we covered, some of that routing data, places data. Let's talk about the areas which people might not be aware is currently being licensed out there. What are some of the emerging capabilities that this has opened up for the end user?
One of the things, I kind of work closely with one of our products at AppGeo called GIS, which works with imagery, but just watching the imagery market. And I think what's really exciting, is around Planet and Planet Labs, now called Planet, and kind of you can task a satellite from their API to go capture an image for you. It's kind of like just mind blowing to even conceive that I could do that from my desk, whether it's a webinar or tasking satellites. Like, oh my gosh, like that's possible, right? And it's not outside your reach. There's lots of pricing we could talk about. We can get into that, but it's attainable for projects. Like I was thinking about counting tractor trailers, I'll just go task some satellites to capture that data and go count them, right? Feature extraction is another big one, whether it's from imagery, whether it's from LiDAR, there's Google's been doing it forever, used from their Street View asset, right? They're helping to enrich their underlying data by looking for address numbers on houses. Ecopia, a partner, from a data perspective with Hexagon, doing the feature extraction of buildings, impervious surface, grass, forest, all of the various kind of varietals of land cover, using machine learning algorithms to kind of create these data products that can be refreshed as that underlying data gets refreshed. We mentioned it already, but automobiles, I think, are going to be a huge data sourcing asset for the entire world. There are, Kia is heavily invested in the automotive kind of space, and they really, are going to be providing, more information for us to kind of feather into our projects. Mobility data, your cell phone, we're all capturing data for whether we know it or not. And I recommend people learn a little bit about how your phone may or may not be helping these companies amass information. But I was working with mobility data during the pandemic, and I could see dog walkers going to the beach. I could follow their tracks. And if I was trying to segment, very discreetly, you could see so much in this information. The potential use cases are so broad. It's just striking to me. And IoT systems and the groups that are deploying those, whether it's from a security perspective or whether it's from just your home IoT kind of information, that all of that data, high level, is going to be flowing out into the marketplace for us to consume in various ways.
Sounds like a brave new world out there, right? Yeah. So the imaginations are the limits, and you've named quite a few discrete use cases there. Why don't we walk through an example for our audience of what this looks like for those who maybe haven't gotten as much exposure to AI and ML, what that really means from a geospatial practitioner perspective.
This topic's deep, but I think these two images kind of expose at least the two ways that we think about feature extraction, or the automated way in which you approach it. The one on the left is actually an Ecopia screenshot showing some of the differentiation that they classify using imagery and likely other data sets to kind of delimit these features. So, kind of, a supervised and potentially unsupervised models to do these things on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we actually worked, with an agency that was responsible with the oil and gas infrastructure, but we use an expert systems approach, which used the actual morphology, in an expert system approach to kind of basically look at the slope, the change in slope, so we had elevation data, or the change in color of the actual, imagery using the RGB kind of bands to ultimately identify these tank features in their variety of ways that they represented themselves in their area of interest. And I think it's going to be really interesting to leverage these two ML and expert system approaches to try and build the training data to ultimately extract features. So lots of interesting work going out there. The degree to which it goes into the open source, it's just amazing to see the papers and the methods and training data that are just on GitHub. So really just staying in tune to that and keeping your mind open. But I could talk at a lot about this, so we can keep moving. But exciting
Absolutely.
stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable to think at one point earlier in my career, I spent probably a whole summer clicking the boundaries of impervious surfaces to draw those polygons. Now that can be accomplished by a satellite automatically, potentially. So quite the quick evolution in our field. Let's go now back to the customer's perspective for a bit and talk about costs and, why is this a good thing, or is it a good thing? What are the benefits of leveraging licensed data versus the traditional data when it comes to, the expenditure and the procurement side? And I think, Bill, you probably would have a good
Sure.
insight into this to start.
Yeah. So, a lot of this data is the systems that capture it are very sophisticated. When you think about, the cost to launch a satellite, develop the sensor and have it launched and all of that, and have all the ground stations, there's huge upfront investments in that. And so the way to spread that cost among the users is to have many users of the data. So if you contrast what I described, 10 minutes ago as, this work for hire model where you would write up a specification and contract with a company to create data that you own. Well, when you do that, you have to bear the full cost of that data set as a single user of it. And what these licensing models do is they spread that cost out over the full population of users. And that's a very powerful way to bring the cost down. And it turns the data into less of a niche specialty item to something approaching a commodity item. And so what the companies that are doing that have licensed data is they're trying to understand a range of use cases and have data that's adaptable to meet the requirements of multiple use cases out of the same data set, sometimes with derivative products, sometimes with different post-processing and that sort of thing. But the idea is you bear that cost of collection as to spread it out over multiple users. And that's the magic of how licensing has become so popular, because it's lowered the barrier of entry to so many people to be able to access these very sophisticated data sets that they probably couldn't, in many cases, afford to do a work for hire. You're not going to be able to absorb that 100% cost. And this model is now making that available to all of us.
Yeah, that sounds like a real benefit, especially for a government organization who then might have downstream users who are benefiting. And I think that's a great segue actually into this next section, because you mentioned that in some cases you have to give up, specificity to achieve these data sets. But in our example here that I think we want to share, we're going to see a story of where they were actually to regain some of what they wanted out of that data set and achieve something that was very practical and useful within the way they were actually using the data. In that case, that's going to be imagery. So can we share a story about, a state who has been really successful and a pioneer in making the license model work, at a grand scale within their geospatial data?
Yeah, and of course, what you're teasing at here is the state of Texas, and Texas has adopted this licensed imagery model and has implemented it in a very effective way. And when you think about the scale of Texas, in the lower 48, they've 250,000 square miles. I was working in the state of New York, and I thought that was a fairly big state. It's about 50,000 square miles, 20% of the area of Texas. So when you're contracting for imagery, you're basically paying for it by the square mile. And when you got that much area, it's just the price tag just becomes exceedingly large and impractical. And with imagery, when you want to get higher resolution, each doubling of resolution quadruples the number of pixels that you're capturing and having to run through your processing and store and all that. So the costs rise pretty rapidly with area and with resolution. And I'm gonna ask David, because David's more involved here in the details of how we're supporting the Texas program. So David, maybe you could fill in some of those details for us.
Yeah, no, from an imagery access perspective, Texas has done a really great job at identifying their user base, right? I think one of the big successes was around identifying those user groups and really considering their needs and how they leverage it and where they leverage it. And also looking, capturing a lot of data about that usage to really help inform how they should go acquire and where they should go, at what resolution, those core questions, really, a lot of times they go by feel. Well, I think, is it the loudest one in the room? Or is it actually how people are using the information? And I think, our Giza product gives them a lot of that data, looking at the actual tile usage. But we've just been watching them be able to, and sharing, understanding the usage, sharing the cost across those intra-state groups, as well as universities and some other groups that they brought into the imagery program, being able to go do buy-ups under these licensed kind of regimes to then serve in those areas where there's greater need for greater resolution at a greater cadence. So really wonderful to watch that happen and seeing others kind of take note nationwide about how to leverage this kind of content.
If I could pipe in just a second here, as I'm sure our audience appreciates it. For Texas, in this program, there's actually 6-inch data statewide. Even the very sparsely populated West Texas areas, 6-inch resolution imagery for that whole footprint. Just amazing, and they are doing this under a cost share model where a whole bunch of the agencies are pooling their funds together to be able to get that kind of incredible product with fast refresh and that kind of resolution for an area as big as Texas. I think that's just an incredible success story.
And those tanks you saw are in Texas, and that data allowed them to go and pursue and understand whether or not comparing the licensed kind of tanks against the reality of where they were to address the potential for impacts to sensitive waterways, right? So all of this product being essential and having so many other derivative opportunities, but derivatives are a big topic for us to talk about when it comes to licensed data.
For sure. Just sticking on the imagery topic for one more moment. We've gone into detail on this in prior webinars, but again, it was that public demand for a statewide program that led Hexagon to create what they call Content Plus, which is really a intermediary between their commercial data and then what they're providing for the states. It gave them more opportunity to get what they wanted, right? And we have some great content on that. You can check out on our channel if you want to get more details on that. But one of the big questions that came out of that discussion we had was, what about the public distribution of data? If I go from my state and I want to download the quads, right, and get access for my own project as a citizen, how does that work when they're paying a commercial entity for access as a licensed user?
Yeah, that's a really, really important question, because a lot of government buyers feel like they have a requirement to, in support of government transparency and accountability, to make these data sets available. They're purchased with public funds, that there's an obligation to turn that data around and make it available to the public, right? And that would seem to be at odds with these licensing models. But what we've seen is, now that these licensing models have been around for a little while and they're adapting to these requirements, Texas is a great example, because what Texas was able to get were provisions under their license where they can post for public consumption, that is freely available, downloadable, a version of the data set. Now, the way they were able to get that is the 6-inch imagery is reprocessed to a 12-inch for the public domain download capability. But the raw 6-inch data is still can meet a variety of public purposes on web applications. So, the agencies using this data in Texas can build web applications that allow the public to interact with that data at full resolution And if there is a requirement that the data be downloaded, they would go to the slightly coarser 12-inch data to be able to download it. So it's a nice way of kind of balancing between those two competing objectives. So the Hexagon is not giving away their full resolution data. They're able to continue to license that to other clients. And Texas is able to support all of those requirements that make the data useful and available to the public.
Absolutely. And a shout out to Utah as well, who has a very similar program. That's who you're seeing on the screen here, just outside of the Salt Lake area. So, a couple states that have really locked into this model, embraced it, and we've been hearing good things. Let's turn now to another type of attribute, which many of you may work with, which is the roadway data. Obviously, in those kind of data sets, we're talking less about the pixels and more about the attributes. David, would you give us kind of a quick primer on how this works in the context of licensed data?
Yeah, totally. So we've been, at AppGeo working with DOTs for a long time, and we're partners with HERE, and I think unique to HERE is kind of their willingness to kind of make their data available to kind of deliver to customers to enrich data sets. And, Bill touched on it earlier, but just historically speaking, that maintenance of data was often, imagine you're a state, or a regional kind of DOT trying to maintain, pavement condition and all of these attributes associated with the roadway. It's a lot of work. But HERE's actually been capturing that data because of their history as Navtech and Nokia, and they've set up an amazing data pipeline where they actually have some of those really important elements. Road roughness, speed limits, parking information, the curvature of the roads. The list goes on. But, so we've been thinking about, well, this is an opportunity, right? Let's take good state data that's maintained by professionals that really understand it and try to blend and enrich their data with HERE data to make it even more compelling, even more valuable product. But the thing, where the rubber meets the road is like, what does it mean when whose data is that? And I think that's really the conversation that we've been having. Technically speaking, once you've enriched your data, that is a licensed data product when delivered together, right? Under the terms in which it would be negotiated. So that, but we need to distribute this to the public. When you think from a government entity, that kind of is at odds, right? And you're like, well, this can't be, I can't do this. But the reality, and we're kind of still working this out, still collaborating with HERE to find is, well, you start similar to the imagery, finding ways and use cases in which data needs to flow, like up to the federal level, right? Many times states need to flow their roadway data up, and it really just it's a conversation, right? HERE wants to sell you the data. States and government entities need to work with the data in certain ways, and there's just really an opportunity here to kind of architect an agreement that allows for commerce and work to be completed. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what to think about in those negotiations, but this can be extrapolated to when you think about enriching your data with licensed product. This is kind of the thought process. It's possible, but you need to think about how your data is going to be used. You really need to kind of lay out your use case and be ready to bring that to the data provider so they can really understand what you're trying to do. But we'll provide more context to that kind of conversation in a few slides.
Absolutely. Anything to add there, Bill?
Well, yeah, I actually started out at the DOT in New York in 1984. And in those days, the DOT did almost all of its own data collection. So everything that they wanted to be keeping track of, whether it was a sign inventory or culverts or guardrails or whatever, they had to send crews out in the field and build those inventories on their own. And now when you think about what's going on, we have basically every modern vehicle is a rolling data collecting sensor. And so companies like HERE are able to track the movement of vehicles, and from that, generate traffic counts. I mean, even the traffic count stuff back when I was working at the DOT a million years ago, we would have to send a crew out, put the tube across the road with the counter and, chain it with a padlock to a telephone pole so it wouldn't get stolen. And you would collect the data for a period of a few weeks and then extrapolate from there. Well, now, I mean, that's so antiquated. We have all this more granular, more comprehensive data based on movement traces that's so much richer than anything we could have ever collected back in the Dark Ages. And so, I just see this as there's no turning back. And so every DOT has kind of abandoned those in-house data collection things and are embracing these systems that you can collect from LiDAR, from vehicle-based LiDAR and imagery. You can collect all of your asset inventories and conditions and movement and all that. That's much fresher and more useful than anything we would have done in the past.
Absolutely, and just sounds like a better use of human resources too, where that same crew setting up the traffic counter across the road now can be working on something possibly more beneficial for the organization. Valuable human power. I want to now transition into the third section of our talk, and here's where we're going to be covering the idea of terms of service. We've alluded to this throughout the presentation, but we want people to know what to be aware of, how to be an informed buyer, and we're also going to give you some strategies for how to negotiate to be able to take full advantage of the data, and in some instances to make your dollar go further with these licensed products. So, to start off, can you explain for us why we have to work within these terms in the first place, right? What is the purpose behind the idea that there are terms?
Yeah, well, these are the rights you have to use the data. So, you don't own the data. The license is basically the right to use it, and under what circumstances. And we all click through I agree terms all the time without reading them. But when you're talking about in the case of a government agency acquiring data to meet some big public purpose, you really do need to read these terms. You do need to understand what you're getting and what limitations they impose, right? And so this is the part that I think a lot of people just want to cover their eyes and move on to the next step. But this is really, really important stuff.
Yeah, and we've seen examples of people kind of jumping and applying because they're so excited. It seems like such a rich future and there's all this information, and then they get to a point in their project where you start asking questions, and then it's like, oh my goodness, that we've seen projects come to a halt quickly as we get involved and trying to understand what's going on. So that's why we wanted to kind of get into it. But Bill's going to lead into on some key elements on what to think about as we approach them.
Yeah, so I'm not going to read all the bullets on this slide here, but under your licensing terms, one of the big ones is the scope of who has access and rights to use the data. So you might be licensing it for your own agency, or maybe you're licensing it for your agency and all the other state agencies in your state. Maybe you also need to include counties and local governments. And maybe you need to include the university sector or some nonprofit groups that you work with on some project. So you have to think clearly about who is going to be using this information and make sure that they're included in the scope of the license. Anything that you do with these terms, you can think of these as sliders. The more liberal you want these capabilities to be, the higher the cost is going to be, right? So you've got to balance this. And I'm going to skip past some of these things, but prohibited uses is another really important one. Many of these companies, they've had their legal teams look at them and they want to limit their exposure to liability. So very often they want to exclude uses where people would be making decisions about things that are dangerous, and where they would be potentially exposing the company to a big liability lawsuit. So you have to understand what those limitations are. And then I'm just going to skip to one other bullet here, which is the public facing capabilities. If you're in the government sector, most of the time the things that you're creating, the capabilities that you're building, have to be useful to the public. And so you have to make sure that you're getting enough rights to be able to expose that information in ways that meet those public requirements. So it's really, really important that you pay attention to these details.
Absolutely. I know we've seen a reckoning in the emergency responder space, especially where, the mapping provider doesn't want to take the blame if the ambulance goes the wrong way, and there's suddenly an issue and they're hit a dead end road or something, right? So those type of use cases are often very clearly spelled out. And we've worked with, our work with NG911 and other 911 emergency responder type groups. We see this come up all the time and try to find solutions that work. And from that perspective, I think it's interesting to see that, we talked about a lot of different providers and all of them have different terms. There's no one size fits all agreement. And as such, that makes some providers better suited for certain directions, certain use cases. David, can you explain to us why this variation exists, and a little bit kind of what's going on behind the scenes to, steer people toward one or the other?
Yeah, no, I think we've alluded to some of these points, but just, the same reason that the single organization that I've been talking about will struggle to get all these data products, these larger organizations that you're licensing data from have often made strategic decisions about the data that they're going to bring into their platform, right? I'm trying to solve this industry's use case. I have 80% of it, our data, but I need the 20% to be competitive. So they're going to go out, similarly, have terms associated with their acquisition of that data, and ultimately kind of bake that into their user agreement. And when they're thinking about things, that below the surface context is at play. And so when you're seeing these more restrictive terms, it can be one, this kind of risk posture, protective nature of the company, but it also can be an indication of just the degree in which there's all of these different varietals of data playing a role in creating the solutions that are out there. And it just doesn't allow them to operate with as many degrees of freedom, and conversely, more relaxed or more forward, and open to conversation companies, they probably create more of their own data. They probably have an established pipeline. I mentioned here, that NavTech history, those sensors that they had out on the road many years ago, they built amazing data pipelines for taking that sensor data, organizing it into a way that they could distribute it to their customers. That gives them, relatively speaking, a lot of degrees of freedom when it comes to kind of helping to support client's end use case. Again, they're going to have their terms. They're going to set their initial terms out in a way that protect them, but just knowing there is an opportunity to have conversations with them. Google, conversely, they have built an amazing global coverage of data that is like, it's every country, just the concept of amassing that volume of data is just astonishing. But at the same time, they've had to source their data from lots of other different sources. They're building their own data, just like here. But that's why you kind of see in Google's kind of terms that they might be a little more protective, and geography will matter in those discrete conversations, whether you have an international company trying to do something as compared to maybe a North American company. We've seen different conversations play out differently around terms of service because that geography and those underlying terms in the universe playing a role in how they can operate. So that's kind of where the variation comes from.
You make a great point there, in that these mapping platforms in general are global coverage, and different laws apply across different continents. It's really, I think, more beneficial to imagine these platforms as a patchwork quilt rather than a solid blanket. And they seam it all together. It's nice and connected, but in reality, you're really tapping into sometimes very different source data. So let's talk now how to put some of the power back into the hands of our audience here. The real question is, can they negotiate? And are certain providers more likely to negotiate? I think you alluded to that in our last answer, but what are you wanting to bring to the table when negotiating and advocating for your use case? Let's talk about that for a few minutes to close out the presentation.
Just quick, short answer is yes. Companies want to do deals. They want to talk to you. I kind of said it before, but bring a well-formed thought about what you're trying to do and what data you want to do when you're going to go into these conversations, so that you can most efficiently get to where you're trying to go. We've had many conversations, lost in translation use cases, things come out in conversations, which can make this process a little more challenging. Anything to add, Bill?
Yeah, well, yes, absolutely. These companies are all vying to grow their market share and become the more dominant player in these market verticals. So they have a strong motivation to meet your needs and get you as a customer. And it's important also to think about the scale of these things. When I was the Geographic Information Officer for the state of New York, that was a big client, a big potential prize for companies. So yeah, I think they would have been more willing to negotiate with me than with, say, a single county that wants to do something. So when you say geography matters, that's definitely been my experience.
All right. And yeah, just other little tips to consider when negotiating. I think these are all good things to consider here.
Yeah, let me just kind of wade into some of these quickly. Looking at our time, I want to leave room for our Q&A. But I think the other thing to be consider is we all have great ideas. We all are trying to solve our problems, but are you trying to solve similar problems that the data providers are trying to solve as well? If you are, you might be competing with them. So it's not as much in their interest to sell you their data. So that's just a kind of a high level kind of consideration, and there's definitely some gray in there. As it relates to what you do with the data, in your publishing plans, or especially as a governmental entity, will your good work actually make the need for their data decrease? Because you've at least extracted or expressed some of the inherent value. They're going to think about that, right? They want to help you do your job. They want to help you answer your clients' questions, but they might say, you can do all of that, but just don't show as many people, because they might not need our data. So again, that's when you kind of understand your use case, what problems you're trying to solve. Like, yes, you want to solve as many people's problems as possible, but you might have trouble on the terms if you're trying to make it too expansive and it plays a competitive kind of, you're impacting or becoming a competitive presence out there. We've talked about size, AOI, like, yes, they're willing to negotiate, but we've seen very large deals with the largest brands in the world that are ready to pull the trigger to license data. And, it just is too much. Like, sometimes it doesn't matter. Sometimes the legal kind of powers that be, or the overall objectives of that licensing entity will ultimately say no. Like, it's not just I'm the biggest one in the room. They're going to agree with me, and I have the final trump card. And we've seen that fall apart, after extensive conversation. So again, back to the top, being able to be clear up front about what you want to do and save yourself some time. And we have seen special use cases, especially during the pandemic, where providers were allowing things that we'd never seen their data be used for the greater good, which I think all of our partners have been great stewards and supporters of kind of their broader communities in which they operate. So these are just some topics, and we could go way deeper into all of these.
For sure.
Yeah.
I think it's worth looking real quickly at like one example that I think much of our audience can relate to, like geocoding. Maybe you had your own geocoding engine developed in the past, but now many are leveraging these APIs for geocoding. Like real quickly, if I do a geocode, do I own those results? And if so, what can I do with it?
Short answer, no, it's there. It's there, lat long. Your input, the output is theirs. That's their point. But I think geocoding in generally, traditionally, I'm going to geocode my data and store it locally. I think you really need to, when you think about geocoding, you think about your solutions, you should really be conceiving about where that data is valuable in the kind of solution lifecycle. Can we just, settle, on that using it live and just requesting the answer when I need it really does solve the problem. And also by not storing it and creating a copy, if data does get improved and that same question is asked in 3 months, you might get a better location. You might see this, map on the right-hand side, but maybe 3 months ago, the science, center at, Rutgers University had the point location out in the parking lot, and now it's at the front door. Leveraging geocoding engines, allow you to make sure you're always getting the best results available as these, providers continue to invest in the underlying data.
Absolutely, especially in the real estate sector where things are moving around quite fluidly with businesses opening, closing. Data that was accurate 2 weeks ago might not be accurate today. And that's, I think, a good lesson to think about when it comes to requesting versus maintaining. And we're really reaching the end of our presentation here, but again, just to bring it full circle, Bill mentioned this, I think, at the very beginning, but we like to think of this as a blended strategy for success where, it's not about completely switching to a licensed product for everything, but integrating it into that smoothie, right? With your existing data where it makes sense, and spend more time on the analysis side and less time on the collection side.
Yeah, absolutely, Aaron. So I really do believe if you're a geospatial professional in the public sector, this is going to be your future, is blending these new data sets, these more innovative data sets than you've ever had in the past, blending those with government data and creating really robust applications that combine the power of both. And so you really have to have a clear understanding of your requirements. You need to approach the licensed data not with, this has got all these limitations, I should resist it. No, you want to embrace it and work with that provider to negotiate the ways. There may be some ways that you haven't given full thought to that can meet those requirements. I love that example we talked about earlier with Texas, in being able to provide a public domain version of the data, which would have, out of the gate would have seemed impossible, but they were able to come to terms with that. And that's a great answer.
For sure. So, just to wrap up, where we come back into the picture, we want to help you interpret this, use this, make it part of your geospatial life. So David, can you kind of close us out with our concept here of being the data trail guide?
Yeah, you hopefully have gotten an appreciation for, we've kind of been having these conversations for a long time. We've been to the top of the mountain. The weather's been terrible on certain adventures, and we've seen the most beautiful vistas that we could imagine in success, helping our customers have success. I think we'd love to engage in conversations, potentially execute on opportunities where we can be your guide, and help you get there faster, right? Time is really there's so much out there. How do we do this efficiently? How do you make the best decision for your entity and ultimately, yield and create the best kind of solutions and answers to your questions?
Absolutely. And any closing words of advice from you, Bill, for those in the government audience?
No, I want to get right to the Q&A, Aaron.
All righty. Well, send your best questions to Bill because he's rearing to go. I would like to remind you all that where you can find this recording as well as many other webinars and videos on our newly branded channel, dubbed the Mapping Channel. We recently relaunched all of our content there. We'd love to have you all as subscribers where you can explore lots of interesting topics, speakers, content, and much more. We're hoping to grow this into a really energetic space for sharing ideas and knowledge within the community. So again, thanks for being part of that, and head on over for much more. So from here, I'd like to go into Q&A where you can ask Bill and David directly anything that you've been wondering about licensed data, about maybe any of the providers that we've mentioned. I'd love to see you pick their brains a little and see what interesting questions you can come up with. And we have the Q&A open now for any of those. I'll start with the first one here that came in about when we were talking about streets. How can I work with providers to ensure that my street data is accurate? Is there a way to fix the incorrect data that I sometimes see?
That's a great question. Yeah. David, you want to go ahead with it?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So this has been a challenge, right? We started using in our AppGeo product the Google Maps API, which had great roadway data, but there's oftentimes, I just added a new road subdivision. When is the data going to get updated? Many of the major providers today, and Google actually has a resource that allows you to, geodata uploader. Reach out if you're interested in learning more. We can provide some more documentation, but allowing you to kind of send that to Google, and they've been increasing the efficiency in which they can evaluate and update underlying data. I think, here, similarly, if you're, working with different data providers, they have different ways, some more developed than others, to help, ensure that underlying data is accurate inside their inside their models, right? Whether it's a visual representation in a base map or whether it's the actual underlying road network in which they apply routing kind of guidance to. There are opportunities to kind of funnel your data in a well-formatted way to kind of improve that. And we support many clients that see those deficits to make sure they're, anybody, whether it's inside their applications that are being supported by these entities, or whether it's just for the broader kind of consumption understanding, many, public resources consume the same information to make sure their best representation of data is out there in the market. So yes, is the answer.
Yeah. And if I could just layer on a little more there actually are some emerging standards around this. The way a lot of the online applications are able to give you the times of buses and trains and subways. So apps have now have agreed to, these companies that support these apps have agreed to a standard by which they can ingest the information on schedules from transit companies. It's just one example where the industry that's behind all this licensed data has come to agreement with government organizations that are the source of key pieces of information to make it easy to share that with the public. And we're starting to see, there's another standard that's under discussion very actively right now around highway safety related to construction zones and where there are low bridges and those sorts of things that are sometimes the source of navigation apps failing to flag the right things. You might send an overheight vehicle that can't clear a bridge, for example, without that information. And so this is another area where the industry has rallied around something that's useful both to them and to the public. And so everybody has an interest in making it work. And so these open standards have evolved. So I think these are great things.
And I expect more partnership in the future because there are so many instances where only that government knows when that street is going to be shut down, and that has huge implications for the effectiveness of their applications. We had a fresh question just come in I want to make sure we get to. This one comes in from Eric, and he asks, what expectations could one have on long-term availability, cost, and value for historic imagery data? And I think this is a great question because there is great value in historic data from a temporal perspective.
Maybe Eric's good.
I was just going to say, my experience in the state of New York is we posted a lot of historic imagery that you could then select to display against current imagery. And that's a super powerful capability and very, very popular. And in a lot of cases, these older data sets allow you to pick up really important insights about trends and things like sites that might be contaminated from a prior use that you would figure out from what's visible in older imagery. So it's really, really important stuff. And this is another example where we'd be talking about blending. You might own a collection of historic aerial imagery as a government organization and want to blend that with some new licensed imagery and to be able to look at those changes over time. And those are really, really good uses of and good examples of that blending. David, I'm sorry, I cut you off too.
No, you jumped in there. You beat me to it, which is fine. And I think I think there is inherent value. The temporal having a larger temporal sample of an area to look at change is huge. When you think about the cost associated with doing that, we've been kind of working with states and kind of trying to evaluate, like, okay, I've amassed this massive catalog, and what we're storing is we've got tiles which make it readily available to render all this content easily in any application, but we have also data about usage. And so there's starting to be some kind of, cost kind of conscious, decisions about, well, how much do we actually want to kind of preserve as tiles that's readily available, and kind of thinking about usage, also thinking about population density, thinking about how can we be really smart about storing what we need to help answer the most common questions. I think everyone's hanging on to the data. There's talks about compression. But there is a balance to be had there because you want this historic imagery to be ready to do more maybe machine learning driven kind of change detection. And you really need to consider, well, great, I can compress my data, but I've lost information. There's lossy standards and I could go way deep into that. But really, I think being really smart about your usage, considering who might be trying to answer questions, and then making good fiscal decisions about the storage regime, putting it potentially a more affordable cloud storage regime. All the providers have different levels of storage which are more affordable. So definitely keep it, but how much, in what format, there's a few different parameters to consider when you get at the cost associated with that.
Absolutely. I know we dove into this topic in our a couple of our past webinars where we talked about leveraging those past archives of data with the new data that's coming out that will eventually be old itself, and then the refresh. So it's quite the life cycle. We've seen good things, and the good news, I think, for the consumer is that all these companies want the latest and greatest up, and once it's old, they don't tend to be as protective. So often the terms become looser once it's a couple of years past. From what we've seen in many terms, in terms of what that state is allowed to do down the road.
I might want to frame. I think the terms still persist for some of those data that were acquired. I think there's always an opportunity to talk with the data providers. Those terms persist, but we have, after you become a customer, right? They want to keep you as a customer. And again, getting back to the overall negotiate, creating a business relationship, there are opportunities out there for sure to kind of make sure that those terms still make sense.
Great. We have one final question here, unless others come in. I appreciate everyone for sticking through to the bitter end of our lovely talk today. This one is about that machine learning aspect. It is, am I allowed to run machine learning with licensed data? I want to develop a model that will, let's see. Well, it sounds like they're looking to use this licensed data in the context of machine learning. Is that something that they can do?
Sounds like a derivative products conversation, David.
Yeah, that was your slide. I was like, yep, that's number 4 on Bill's list. I think, I want to say yes. I think machine learning is a very hot topic. People are, whether it's in academia or in the commercial space, everyone's trying to develop, models that solve the most tractable front and center problems that are out there. There are many other problems which are smaller in nature or more niche. I think when you're considering, was this going to be supported? Will they let me use their data to answer my question? If that's a question that has, billion-dollar implications, probably not, because they want that market space. But if it's smaller in nature, if the geography is smaller, I think we have seen exceptions made for derivative use, especially as it comes to, who's going to use that derivative, right? There's, it's yes, but, right? So again, coming back to that conversation with your provider, explaining what you want to do, being willing to kind of maybe modify the extent of which you might be able to leverage that, and kind of ultimately weighing whether that decreases the potential value of the project if I can't use it in all of the ways that it might generate value. So yes, but I believe this licensed content will be able to flow into custom machine learning models. You just have to work with your provider.
For sure. And just a note that, sometimes it depends on the downloadability and different aspects of that, of how you're feeding it in. But, we love those type of challenges, and we'd love to hear what you all are up to. So feel free to be in touch. We have Bill's contact there on the screen, but feel free to leave us a note if there's any questions that we haven't covered, and we'd love to dive into it deeper with you. At this point, I would like to thank both Bill and David for their time of being part of this panel, and to our whole audience for being with us here today and being part of the conversation. So we will see you all next time, and look forward to having you join us in a future presentation.
All right. Thank you, Aaron. Thanks everybody.
Thanks all.